I'm German. I was born in Germany, actually a city, Dresden, that was deeply impacted by World War II. My father, all of my grandparents, all of my great-grandparents have been deeply impacted by World War II. This is a trauma that runs through my family. And although none of them were active Nazis, none of them resisted either. They all collaborated and in some ways even benefited from the Third Reich. And growing up in German society, in a city that is very connected with the story of World War II, I have been kind of haunted by this reality that the people I come from created, ran, or at least tolerated Auschwitz. And by the fact that this reality, despite all the remembrance culture in Germany, hasn't been really processed by the generations that came after. Like there is this vow of never again, but there is not really a deep reckoning with why it happened in the first place and what it says about us, our culture. And if you kind of imagine the human experience inside the system, including the human experience of the people responsible for a fascist regime, then of course you ask yourself, if I had lived in such a time, what would I have done? How can I be sure I would have acted differently than my ancestors? How could I have been sure I would resist rather than be silent or even an active part? And my political activism started at 14 with those questions and ethical doubts or processes in the back of my heart and my head, with the rise of a neo-Nazi party in the state that I grew up in. So I became part of anti-fascist movements, and that kind of started me on a track that I'm on still today. And then when I actually first came to Tamara as a teenager, I found this book that is called The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, who was a disciple of Freud. And it deeply changed my political thinking. I remember still like reading it and having this moment of like kind of a lot of things collapsing and a lot of new avenues opening. And one core statement of this book is that fascism is not just a political ideology, but a basic feature in the character structure of people who grow up under repressive, loveless, authoritarian conditions. And so, in a way, Wilhelm Reich shifted the understanding of fascism from the merely external kind of political, ideological, economic realm to something that also happens inside of me, of people, that is even more elementary or is primary to our political ideologies. And looking at the world today with the rise of far-right authoritarianism in more and more places, I believe that unless we gain a deeper understanding of fascism and the forces that enable it, be it capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, or also childhood or ancestral trauma, and come face to face with the fascist within, we stand little chance to counter the wave of fascist violence now hitting the world. So this is kind of this is for me the motivation of why I'm doing writing on this topic, and also this is the invitation for this time. So I just want to cover a few points. looking a little bit at what is fascism, because sometimes the definitions are blurry. A small view at fascism today, not really the daily politics, so much could be said about this. And then mainly offer four potential answers to the question of why are we seeing this rise of fascism today. And it's not meant as a conclusion or a point of arrival, but really more as a starting point for a conversation. So I'm very aware that anything that I say will be incomplete, and it's anyways just such short time for such a huge topic. So what is fascism? It's a term that is also thrown around a lot, sometimes vaguely. Different definitions depending on where people stand ideologically. But most of the definitions will include authoritarian leadership and anti-democracy, ultranationalism, suppression of dissent, militarism, charismatic leadership, belief in a master's race, extreme patriarchy, traditionalism. But I always find that a point that is often overlooked, because of course people accept that it's authoritarian rule, is corporatism, which is actually which is part of the original definition of fascism, which arose as a term under Mussolini in Italy. And corporatism really is the kind of the merger of corporate capitalism and state power. So the state functions as this repressive organ that will ensure the perfect conditions for the biggest possible maximization of corporate power. A short look at fascism today. So, of course, we can look at different countries, different contexts, but so what I'm going to say is like a gross generalization. But we can say that today's far-right movements are generally unified by proud anti-environmentalism, as in drill baby drill, the dismantling of environmental regulations, rollback of the green transition, unapologetic misogyny, sexism, cis-heterosexism, reckless racism, as in, for example, prescribing of brutality against migrants and BIPOC and other racialized groups. We also see it in authoritarianism, the repression of dissent, protest, political organizing. For example, Trump's promise to outlaw and squash the solidarity movement with Palestine and other movements. We also see a sort of colonial enthusiasm and solidarity on an international level. Again, I will quote Trump with his push for, quote unquote, cleaning out Gaza, call for massive ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And also generally we find a kind of populist pro-workers discourse. So leaders speaking for the little man, the steel worker, the factory workers, but actually an aggressive escalation of what Marxists would call class war. So the dismantling of social welfare programs, the simultaneous cutting of taxes for the rich, the deregulation of capitalism, really conducting a massive wealth redistribution from the bottom 99% to the richest, not even 1%, but really more like 0.01% of the population. And something that is also quite interesting is that far-right movements in different parts of the world, both sides of the Atlantic definitely, have been able to gain and tap into seemingly unlikely new constituencies in alternative wellness, new age scenes, even anti-war scenes, in what some people call the quote-unquote wellness to fascism pipeline. I'm saying this while the confirmation hearings for Robert Kennedy Jr. are going on. And COVID-19 was a big watershed moment in this. So many people, I don't know if there's data, but I think many people who believed that COVID-19 was a plot by the global elite to usher in a new world order also believed that Biden stole the 2020 election, or believed that movements like Black Lives Matter were paid puppets of Jewish billionaires to bring in, again, a new world order. Or that climate policies are a way for governments to impose a China-style form of communist dictatorship. So these have been kind of narrative pathways to bring in health-aware or alternative people into political camps that so far these groups have never been in, that were traditionally more on the left. Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger is one that I really recommend. She helps us make sense of this very confusing, what she calls mirror world. Okay, but the rise of fascism isn't just the success of the Trumps, the Modis, the Netanyahus, the Le Pens, but it's also in the fascist turn of Western centrists. I think this is also important. It's easy, especially in liberal progressive circles, we can go on forever talking about far-right people, and but it's important also to see that the far-right is increasingly setting the political agenda also in so-called centrist or moderate right-wing people. So brutal immigration policies, the increase of mass surveillance, massive wealth redistribution from the poor to the rich, and also the revival of European Western imperialism. Those things have also happened under the watch of leaders like Biden and Macron. I will not continue now because this is not a political class on the ideologies and the policies of fascism, but I just wanted to give you a bit of to cover a bit of what we are talking about, and I'm aware many of you will be familiar with these things as well. Now, what I mainly want to focus on is what are some of the reasons for the rise of fascism, and what does it have to do with us? Again, I said this already, but this is not at all exhaustive or complete. I just want to mention 4 lines that I often find missing from conversations around this topic. I'll give them succinctly so we have more time to have conversations about this. The first one for me is economic necessity. So global capitalism relies on perpetual GDP growth, meaning economies need to grow at least 3% per year in order not to collapse on the debt that is created as currency is created. So more mining, more consumption, more deforestation, more exploitation of workers every year in order for the system not to collapse onto itself. We know that infinite growth on a finite planet is somewhat of an insane proposal. And at some point, such a system hits material and also social limits. And we are in this point. To maintain capitalism ecologically, materially, and also socially, with the dimension of ecological devastation and also mass impoverishment, mental health crisis, social inequality that we are seeing is less and less possible under the circumstances of liberal democracy. Because very simply speaking, too many people are suffering too badly, are hurting too much in order for societies to function democratically. So in order to maintain an economic system that requires more and more devastation of the planet's ecologies, that requires more and more wealth concentration on the top, that requires more and more exploitation of people, simply needs oppressive, totalitarian state power, policing, in order to protect the interests of the wealthy and the economy. So in a way, you could also say fascism is capitalism's survival strategy in the face of its own collapse. And I also want to breathe in between, just noticing myself speaking to intense realities. The second reason I want to mention is that liberalism has blocked progressive politics. So what I mean by this is that in the last 14 years, especially since the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street and that time, we've seen massive eruptions of popular rebellion, of outrage and uprisings against capitalism. We've also seen a worldwide political awakening towards the systemic injustices under the system. Riding this wave, we've had progressive movements, radical left movements in different parts of the world that have either been blocked from entering power or were forced into submission and surrender while they were in office. So that tide of desire for radical change in the system has kind of clashed against the wall of existing liberal mainstream politics. And in many places, liberal centrists have been more focused on making sure that the radical left doesn't get to power or reach its goals than preventing fascists from taking over. We now have the numbers in the United States. It's one example of that. Significant though, for Biden and Harris, maintaining support for the genocide in Gaza was priority over stopping Trump. They knew that this might cost them the elections, and they decided to carry on nevertheless. So there was a German Jewish philosopher called Walter Benjamin, who said, behind every fascism stands a failed revolution. So what happens when there is a desire for radical change that is not successful? It turns sour. Because the hurt, the outrage, the sense of injustice remains. But when there is no positive outlet for it, what takes over is an energy of hatred, a desire to blame people. And with the left unable to deliver on popular desires for radical change, we've seen this far-right insurgence globally, especially since 2016. The far-right really has become the global mouthpiece for popular outrage and rebellion. But it's also important to say that it's a fake rebellion. It's a pseudo anti-establishment politics. Again, Trump speaks a discourse of rebellion against an establishment, while his government is a government of the billionaires, by the billionaires, for the billionaires. But it's also important to point to the fact that liberalism has aided that ascent of fascism to power by blocking system change. And liberalism and fascism are really two sides of this, in my view, really two sides of the same coin, two faces of the same beast. And what unites them is their uncompromising defense of capitalism, their deep commitment to make collective liberation of the oppressed impossible. Take a breath again. We'll talk about for about 10, 15 more minutes, just for your orientation. So the third reason that I see for the rise of fascism is a kind of aggressive rejection of accountability and aggressive insistence on entitlement among privileged groups. So in recent years also, systems of oppression have come under unprecedented challenge by movements for collective liberation, by marginalized groups rising up for equal rights, which have also shed light at the violent flip side of the privileges that white supremacy, patriarchy, cis heteronormativity, classism, ableism, and other systems offer. And as those uncomfortable realities come to light, those privileged have a choice to make, to stop denying, to become accountable, to use one's privilege and power in service of collective liberation, to help transform structures of injustice, or to insist in a way, or to double down on denial and entitlements, and to reject accountability. When these systems become challenged, it's harder for someone with privilege to pretend to be neutral or to be innocent. And so I think part of what makes the far right so attractive is that it offers, that it legitimizes a path for insistence on denial and entitlements and rejection of accountability. And yeah, I mean, I'm speaking of somebody who, for many of these systems of oppression and identity categories, is in the top category of privilege. And unless those of us in positions of power and privilege become aware of that power and privilege, take responsibility for it, stand with the struggles of oppressed groups, that is the path we tend to choose. I want to read a quote here from Ezra Klein, his book, Why We Are Polarized, where he writes, quote, "There's nothing that makes us identify with our groups so strongly as the feeling that the power we took for granted may soon be lost. unquote. But it's also important to say that this feeling that the power we took for granted may be lost, it has so much to do with the socialization into these systems. So part of the socialization into systems of oppression is the idea that the world is the place of an inevitable competition for scarce resources and places of power, that is inherently hierarchical. So through that lens, you are either oppressed or you oppress. And so for many privileged people from this background, the struggle of oppressed groups for equal rights, not for domination, not for overpowering, is seen as a threat to their existence, as a threat of oppression against them. So there's this whole myth, for example, of the white man is now the most oppressed identity, which, yeah, says so much about the socialization into these systems and the fragility behind position of power. And so for the privileged, fascism mostly doesn't arrive primarily as brute force, oppression and dehumanization, but actually as something quite comfortable, the return to normality, the comfort to unchallenged power and privilege. And that is also the appeal in the very slogan of, for example, "Make America Great Again." It's the nostalgic reference to the good old days in which all those systems of oppression were completely unchallenged. Last point I want to mention, which is actually the thing that gets us to the core, I think also of why the team invited me to even give this workshop and talk, is the what we could call the authoritarian character structure. And maybe that is the most profound and most important layer, and also most underappreciated, perhaps, in conversations about fascism, which also is the aspect that this book by Wilhelm Reich, Mass Psychology of Fascism, explores, which really has to do with a very basic fact of people growing up or living in a power over paradigm, authoritarian character structure. Hope that's clear now. So a basic fact of people living in a power over paradigm, which is the fact that most of us, or collectively speaking, we don't know how to live together in trust lastingly. We can't create, or most of us struggle to create lasting social cohesion or unity among people without needing to discharge our aggressive energies onto scapegoats or a shared enemy. Like there's a basic contradiction in kind of social organizing and patriarchy, because certain aspects of life within ourselves and around us are excluded and oppressed, and they need to go somewhere. And if we would put them at each other, it would create our unity. So what collectives do is define themselves through a shared enemy. And social relations, basically, where people are not able to be fully authentic, where they need to conceal and repress parts of themselves, parts of their truth, in a way are a ticking time bomb. They are a breeding ground for fascist explosions, because that energy needs to go somewhere. And I find Wilhelm Reich helpful because he speaks of a character armor. So he speaks of a both psychological and bioenergetic structure that arises in people growing up in kind of repressive, authoritarian, loveless conditions. That is really like a split within their psyches and even their bodies. So he looks at how children who grow up being condemned for their bodies, for their desires, for their vital expressions, be they curiosity or movement or erotic curiosity, and who are punished for that, how they internalize as they grow up. They internalize that voice in themselves. So instead of following the same kind of vital impulses again and again, knowing that they will be punished, they will stop themselves. So they will internalize that message of what you're doing is sinful or wrong or crazy. And so there are two parts in themselves. There is the truth of the body, and there is a disconnected mind. The conscious part of ourselves no longer has access to the bioenergetic or erotic part, and so there is this split between the streaming life energy and this internalized self-judgment, which often then expresses itself as this really conflicting, simultaneous, contradictory situation of having a wish to rebel and a wish to obey, because one is repressed, but also one is afraid of the punishment of authority. And what Wilhelm Reich speaks about is that, in a way, fascist ideologies and systems are psychologically super intelligent, because they accommodate both of these needs simultaneously. They offer obedience to a strong leading figure while opening a channel for collectively discharging this energy of rebellion onto vulnerable groups. And what we can also learn from Reich, which for me is from Wilhelm Reich, which I find is very deep, is this understanding that fascism really results from societies that make people hate that which they once loved, from societies that make people despise their own longings, to the point that they want to eliminate those who actually live them. When we look at, like, what is this intense hatred of, like, queer people, for example, it says so much of the repression of that part within oneself that doesn't fit into the constraints of cis hetero roles or norms. And sexuality always plays a key role in the psychology of fascism, in that it is both really repressed and that there is a huge obsession with sex. Of course, there's always an obsession with sex when it is repressed. But there is a, like, even in the discourse, even in the ideology, there is often this obsession with virginity, with purity. Hitler spoke of the desire to keep the collective body of the German people clean from perverted sexualities. We find that purity thinking also in many of those kind of the circles where kind of the anti-vax and the far right scenes overlap today. Um, and there's also this so there is a deep fear of kind of surrendering to this what is perceived as a threatening, potentially life-threatening force of sexuality, that I think leads, or as Wilhelm Reich describes, leads to this desire for purity, but results in violence effectively. And he also speaks about this drive for erotic unification as a basic expression of life. And the fact that when erotic life energies can conduct this experience of blissful union, people often look for compensation, which can be all kinds of things, of course. It can be consumerism, it can be addictions, it can be striving for careers, but it can also be orgies of violence and mass hatred. I think a reason why fascists love mass rallies is that there is a bioenergetic experience to thousands of people chanting in the same voice a message of hatred against a group that they despise. There is a bioenergetic fascination of being part of disappearing in an emotional mass of people that frees itself from ethical doubts or restraints, if that makes sense. Again, for me as a German, there's one scene from the Third Reich which is very intense. It's in 1939, just as Germany invaded Poland. There was this Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels stood in a huge hall in Berlin with thousands of people and screaming at the masses, at this crowd of people, asking them, "Do you want total war?" And in one voice, with unhinged, absolute enthusiasm, people screaming, "Yes, yes." And again, yeah, we can ask, like, what is this desire? What is this desire to be part of a crowd that screams yes to the most horrible, in a way, surrender of one's own humanity? And I think it is so easy to condemn or to ridicule the fascist. But if we actually empathize with it, which is not the same as justifying it, but to actually open one's heart and to ask, what is this human experience? We can find. I think many of us can find it inside ourselves. I'm about to come to a close, but just want to add a few more things, because these thoughts are also some of the insights that led to the foundation of Tamara as a project. So Dieter Doom, who's the main visionary of Tamara and one of the co-founders, he wrote in his early books that violence is the eruption of blocked life energies. So when a river is forced into a straight canal where it's not allowed to move freely, we tend to have violent flooding. And the same happens to people when we are put into conditions where we cannot express ourselves. Those repressed parts will show themselves, often in ways that are aggressive or harmful. As long as we condemn and exclude aspects of ourselves, we tend to condemn those aspects in others that remind us of them. Whenever dehumanization takes place, usually there is this mechanism at work. And I think, again, like psychologically speaking, it's, I think, important to realize that part of this is an unconscious desire in the people who do the dehumanization, and who want to erase these other beings, to free oneself from an unbearable torment and conflict in oneself. And for Tamara also, this comes down to this idea, again from Dieter Doom, who said that so long as there is blackmailing or scapegoating in our interpersonal relationships, there is a latent danger of fascism in our communities and societies. And Tamara was really started with this idea of like, we can find in a group of people the light and shadow sides of humanity. So trying to understand on a group kind of micro scale these dynamics that are playing out. Yeah, I will repeat that. So long as there's blackmailing or scapegoating in our interpersonal relationships, there is a latent danger for fascism in our communities and societies. Because that is, if you multiply that from the personal up, the idea of dehumanizing a whole group of people becomes acceptable. Which then leads also to an anti-fascism that it's not just necessary. I'm not saying like we need to hug the fascists. I think in some places, like a very clear position is necessary. But for sure, I think an effective anti-fascism has to do with facing that latent structure within ourselves. And what would it look like to create communities where instead of externalizing the conflicts, for example, in our love relationships, in our sexual relationships, in the way we handle power, in the way we handle finance, instead of externalizing that on others, we can actually deal with this energy among us. Good, but I'm exceeding the time that I wanted to take. I'll pause here. Thank you for listening.